we're now on. And so I want to thank you, Gordon Walker, for allowing us to come talk with you.
Pleased to do that.
You've been fortunate enough, but also generous enough to allow yourself to be appointed the new IJC member for Canada, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. What we are hoping to do is help our members understand better who the IJC is, what its role is, but not in a technical way, but in how you see it at a human level, how it's supposed to operate, what it's supposed to do, and then understand a little bit of what you bring to it. That's our goal. So if it's okay with you, I would start out by asking you to describe in your own words, and if you can refer more to the water levels than other things, what the IJC is and what it's supposed to be doing about water levels.
Well, to begin with, the International Joint Commission, the IJC, has a long history, and it goes back to some 104 years now that it's been in existence, and it's perhaps the most successful organization of its type in the world. The boundary of the United States and Canada is some 3,000 miles long, and it has crossing it, crisscrossing it, coming near it, or part of its watershed, something like 330 lakes, rivers, and streams. And it is that forms the constituency of the IJC. And it's a treaty organization, an international organization made up of 3 commissioners from the United States appointed by the President of the United States and 3 commissioners from Canada appointed by the Prime Minister. It's worked this way for now 104 years and has been again one of the most, if not the most successful in the world, in the sense that it solved the disputes.
And so tell me, what does it do?
The IJC really is an organization that makes a recommendation to the high levels of government. A great deal of information has to be fed into the IJC, and a great deal of money is spent in collecting that information. For example, about a week from now, I have to leave for the middle of July a tour around Lake Ontario to about a dozen different cities on the south shore of Lake Ontario and the north shore, and along the St. Lawrence, Cornwall, Akwesasne Reserve, and to Montreal. And we're trying to deal with a new plan to be put on Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario has been governed because of the dams at Messina and New York. It's in Messina and Cornwall. It's been governed as to the head of water that can be achieved on Lake Ontario. That's been in place since 1958. For the last 8 or 9 years, there's been an attempt to sort out that plan and bring it up to date. It is in the final stages now, where we go and hear hearings in various cities to hear what the public have to say on making the final decision, which will be made by the IJC in the next 6 months. Many individuals form a part of the advice that ultimately gets fed into the IJC. For instance, on the levels study, on the levels of particularly the lakes Huron and Michigan, they're one and the same, and Lake Superior, there was a rather massive study done that covered about 5 or 6 years, and then they basically digested the information and came forward with their recommendation finally to government. But in the course of generating their own decision, this particular study, which I think cost many millions of dollars, and that study involved all kinds of scientific information and all kinds of stakeholder information and all kinds of public input, whether it was public interest groups or whether it was the scientific information, plus the political side of knowing what the public had to say, various stakeholder groups like Georgian Bay Association, Georgian Bay Forever, and various other groups. If Stop the Drop had been in place, it would have been very much a part of the public hearings. I know from general knowledge, I've only been on the IJC now for 2 or 3 weeks,
But you'd been there before, right?
I was there for 3 years in the 1990s,
Okay.
and we indeed had some issues relating to the levels, but then it was a bit too much water.
Right.
And so things do change from time to time.
Right.
And the information from the various public organizations came in and was fed in. There were meetings all around the Great Lakes.
Some people feel that the process of public consultation is as much theater as anything else. I'm not asking you to make a statement on that, but what is your experience with what is learned during the process of what do you learn as a commissioner during the public
Well,
discussions?
I think one thing is what is said at a conference and at a meeting of this sort, a public meeting. And the commissioners, in many respects, are judges. And in some respects, we actually have judicial roles. We can subpoena, we can have evidence taken under oath, we can compel evidence. So we have substantial roles. We can order, we can have costs charged against organizations and the like. So we have somewhat judicial roles, and we sit really as judges to hear the information that people have to say. Now, if we take that to democracy and people making their comments, well, sometimes you can have some very, very excitable meetings where you have some people who are very, very upset by the fact that the water is lapping at their doorstep. As we will discover in a few weeks' time, we'll discover some people who are complaining about the water level going up, but also those people may be the same ones who have built on a floodplain, and they might ask themselves, well, was it the right thing to do? So there are interesting observations to be made. People will be there carrying signs and wearing T-shirts likely with messages on them. That was somewhat similar to what it was in the levels meetings that were held around Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and people were quite agitated about it. Some people, by the way, liked it the way it was. Some people, of course, were very upset by the way the levels were at that moment, creating all kinds of havoc for them, especially in some of the wetlands areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In terms of the deliberations that happen afterwards, obviously to a certain extent, what happens in the back room no one knows, but how does one, or in your experience, how does one trade off science, commentary, public passion? What do you do with all that stuff? How do you...
Well, that's a very interesting question. I sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like trying to put the ship in the bottle. It's very easy to say it, but not always that easy to figure out how to get it with a mast on it sitting inside that very tiny bottle. And we have something of a similar problem as we try and balance the interests. And of course, we will never balance the interests perfectly. We will never have everybody happy because you cannot make everybody happy. When people have such conflicting opinions as to we want the water higher, no, we want the water lower, trying to find that right sweet spot is the issue that we try to achieve, and keeping in mind the kind of interests that we're mandated to protect. And we have to keep in mind...
What are those interests? What is the range of specific mandates to protect? Who do you need to protect?
In the Great Lakes, issues of navigation and commercial interests are important, as well as sanitary and other kinds of uses that water would be put to, both sanitary and drinking purposes. And of course, we've acquired all kinds of uses that weren't necessarily there in 1909. Recreational uses are much greater today than anyone could have perceived back then. But cottages were coming into being back then, and those interests were put in and are protected by the International Boundaries Treaty Act of 1909.
Okay. In terms of trading off economic interests versus environmental interests versus public commentary, is there any guidance given to you in your mandate about how to trade off between those things?
It's remember that we make a reference to government. We make our recommendations to government. So in the end, they're the ones that make the decision on what to do. And so if we recommend to them well, as a matter of fact, in the levels situation, the recommendation brought in by the IJC's report to the State Department in the United States and to Department of Foreign Affairs in Canada. That recommendation was that, first of all, the gouging out of River St. Clair had created some problems and had caused a long-term loss of upwards of 18 or 19 inches of waterhead, which, by the way, look around here today where we happen to live, we'd find that very nice to have that 18 inches back. I can tell you that. You've just come through some narrows to reach our home here in Cognishing Lake. And so the fact that that is defined as a recommendation, or actually a finding to government, that's very important. The second is the recommendation to do some kind of compensating works to make up for the fact that this river has been gouged out for other purposes that were quite legitimate, navigation. As a matter of fact, the River St. Clair has been gouged out or dredged for the last 150 years, so it's not a new thing. And so making that river navigable was considered an imperative. We're saying, the IJC said in its recommendation in April, dated April the 15th of 2013, that we make a finding on the loss of the waterhead as having been determined by the gouging out of the river. Secondly, we recommend that compensating works be done to repair the damage. So that is going to the senior levels of government. They must make the decision on what to do. We have simply said to them, this is the recommendation. Now, in fairness, I should report that the recommendation was made before I was appointed to the board, but I support fully what the board has, what the commission has said. So that's going in. How to actually arrive at that conclusion is one of, well, you've got to take into account this interest and that interest on one hand, this hand on the other hand.
Let's talk about this, because you have a unique experience of having also been a politician. And I realize that in answering this question, you're talking more as a person than you are as a commissioner. How might one take the recommendations made that are sort of sitting on the page and actually make something of them?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because you can give different answers to that. One answer I would give is that, well, in the 1960s, the IJC made a recommendation to its senior government, to the United States and to Canada, to do compensating works for the dredging that had happened in the channels. By the time the governments got around to doing something, which is frustratingly long, it was the 70s, and the water levels were so high that if anyone had put in any kind of compensating works that would have caused the levels to be even higher in Georgian Bay and in any of the bays around it, and all of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, if anyone had suggested that, they would have been run out of the city tarred and feathered. So it's one of those situations that's kind of difficult to answer. Because
you've experienced this as a politician, we can't not do something, I guess. My perception of what the public gets upset with is the sense of inertia brought on by contemplating how complicated something is. And I'm interested in thoughts about how one takes something that is very complicated and moves it somewhere.
Well, one thing is to make the recommendations. Two is to have the recommendations acted upon. And by and large, the recommendations of the International Joint Commission have been acted upon. And so that is something of a precedent that works in its favor. And I would say 95% of the time it has had the actions taken. And we saw many actions across Canada, many references where whatever has been said has been taken,
yep.
Not taken poorly, but in fact taken seriously and acted upon. There were special factors that influenced the fact that the recommendations in the 1960s, indeed in the 1930s, by IJC to put in compensating works. Special factors were at work that caused it not to be done, and that was because high water returned.
Okay. Do you think, well, two questions that come from that. Firstly, do you think those special factors exist still? Do you think that the fear of that is something that is going to lead people to just wait and see and not do anything? I mean, is that something that's operating in the background of this issue?
Well, I would hope that that's not the case. I would hope that action would be taken. It is my belief that there are a number of factors that have influenced the low levels that we have today, whether you're talking the Nottawasaga area, whether you're talking the sound at Severn, the Severn Sound, or whether you're talking anywhere around the lakes. It could be talking in Saginaw Bay across the way. The levels today are lower than what they should be because there has been some dredging. But there are other reasons why they're low. We all know in Georgian Bay that there's a cycle to the water levels, and sometimes the levels are high and sometimes the levels are low, and that generally has been maybe a 35-year cycle, as I've kind of watched over 2 or 3 of the cycles that I've been able to research. And I've personally watched a cycle as I've lived in this area for the last 40 years during my summers. So I know something about cycles. That's one thing. We can't do anything about that. The cycle is a cycle, and it's going to happen regardless. Secondly, there is the influence of climate change. And while I would like to do my part for climate change, none of us are going to be able to do enough to solve climate change. We will be lucky if the world recognizes climate change in our lifetime enough to be able to alter that part of the equation. But I know this for sure. In the year 2012, the climate change was such that we did not have that ice cap that we needed in our Georgian Bay Islands, and we did not have the snow load within the watershed behind the islands that would have provided us with the spring runoff, as we call it, a freshet. We didn't have that in 2012. This year, in 2013, it's been much better, and the water levels have come up half a meter since January to sometime now here as we talk in July. So there's that question of climate change, and then there's even the tectonic plates.
Yes, but they're
these
tiny.
Things can move,
Yes.
to change things, and I'm told that our area in the Parry Sound side has gone up 25 centimeters. It's risen that much in 100 years, and correspondingly in the Chicago area, it has sunk by something like that in 25 years or in 100 years. So those are things we can't do anything about.
Yes.
But one thing we can do something about is the effect of the dredging that has happened in the St. Clair River. That we can do something about. And so, to my way of thinking, when we bring that back to level neutral, if that's the right word to use, to a point where it is exactly what it should be if it hadn't been done, that, to my way of thinking, is what we should be doing and what we should encourage. And that's the kind of approach that I would be taking in my role as a new commissioner to the IJC. In fact, interestingly enough, 20 years ago, when I was on the IJC, we had a levels report to us that was brought in 1993, and it basically said that if the levels on Lake Huron and Lake Michigan reach a point where it crosses through a threshold that they defined in terms of meters above sea level, at that point in time, action should be taken to immediately put rocks, in that case was to put rocks, probably rocks the size of a Volkswagen, in the St. Clair River at certain strategic points to block up the water and to force more water back into Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And that would be a good thing, but as they said, be sure to have some money set aside so that when the waters go back up again, you can pull those rocks out.
Okay, so do you think this is something that the government can just do? You made the IJC is making a recommendation. Is the government able to just wave its magic wand and do it? What is required to bring something like that into reality?
Well, that's the difficult part of the ship, I guess. It takes a while to happen in government, and what it really takes is they have their own environmental issues, so they will have to, environmental assessments and things of that, so they'll have to determine that kind of aspect. They'll have to determine what kind of compensating work should be used, and there are many suggestions from wing dikes to training walls to inflatable flaps that will rise up and cause the water to be blacked up, to just putting rocks in the water, or maybe even diverting some water here and there.
But to decide which of those to use presupposes that you've made a public pronouncement that you're going to do something.
That's right. The governments will have to conclude that they want to do something. I'm getting good sounds from the Canadian government, from what I hear. They're anxious to do something. I don't know what's coming out of the U.S. government because I'm not privy to anything there, but I'm hearing some things, and that's not. I'm hoping that I'm hearing that they're going to do something, and so if they decide to do something, then will probably say to the IJC, what do we need to do now? And that's when we'll be expected to come in with some kind of recommendation. Maybe it will be rocks. Maybe it will be. Maybe it will be the inflatable bladders, or maybe it will be some other kind of blockage. But something that's called compensating works. But that kind of thing can take years.